Hi, thank you for watching. I recently saw two videos by criminal profiler Pat Brown covering the Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon case. Now, I saw those two videos. Now, the first video was about 3 hours long. Now, I stopped watching at around the 2 hours and 30-minute mark, somewhere around there. She was in the question and answer period. It was getting a little redundant. And overall, I was just so disappointed in Pat Brown. She did such a haphazard job that I thought she did an incomplete job, and I expected more. So I didn't want to listen anymore. I couldn't take it. The second video, I did watch the whole thing. And I really struggled whether to critique Pat Brown on these two videos because, as a man, we're supposed to honor and respect females. And I didn't want to come across as being a bully or badgering Pat on this case. But on the other end of the spectrum, I also didn't want people that saw all these things that pointed to foul play on this case, but then dismiss all these things that point to foul play because Pat Brown, a criminal profiler, says that foul play did not happen. And they just, because what Pat Brown says, they forget about everything else. And I'm telling us that we should not do that. We should all be able to think for ourselves, gather evidence, and make our own conclusions on things. Pat Brown said that there's no evidence that points to foul play. Well, Pat, why didn't you bring up any of the eyewitnesses? I saw 2.5 hours, 3 hours of your first video, all your second video. Why didn't you bring up the eyewitnesses of the case? The backpacker coach, he does an awesome job covering what the eyewitnesses say, where they were, and what the eyewitnesses said. And he didn't even cover every single eyewitness. Pat, if you're going to do this case as a criminal profiler, why don't you go over eyewitness testimony? Don't you think eyewitness testimony, although it's not infallible, it does shed light on what could have happened? Why don't you mention the eyewitnesses? There's a very good chance, according to the eyewitnesses, that Kris and Lisanne, they actually didn't start that hike until much later than a lot of people think, which makes that initial phone call for help much shorter than a lot of people speculate. But if you don't go over the eyewitnesses, how would you know that? Now, I'm not saying that you don't know about the eyewitnesses. What I'm saying is, to your audience, I don't recall you bringing up eyewitnesses. How can you cover this case and say there's no evidence of foul play when there's eyewitnesses that put those females in the town and not on the trail at the time many people think they were on the trail? Don't you think that's kind of something you should mention? Those women, I think they either started that hike later than people assume they started it, or they got back. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they got back and they were abducted once they were back into town. But one thing, Pat Brown, I don't recall you going over are the eyewitnesses. No evidence of foul play. And then you mentioned, well, there's a bone that was bleached by the sun. But then you really don't get into the remains, do you, Pat? Why don't you get into the remains? You think that pelvic bone was bleached by the sun? You think the sun bleached it? Well, let me ask you this, Pat. Let me ask you this. You're in the same basic ecosystem, right? You're in the forest in Panama, off from Boquete, close to the Pianista Trail. Basically the same ecosystems. You have, and basically close to the same ecosystems. You have a bone that is bleached, and then you have skin. I don't remember you mentioning this. You have skin that is not decomposed that far at all. And then you have foot bones that are at a different level of decomposition than the skin was, than the pelvic bone. You have this range, this spectrum of decomposition. You don't think that's odd? I mean, we're not talking about one's in the ice cold and one's in the hot desert. We're talking about the same basic ecosystem. And speaking of the bones, I don't recall you even mentioning that there was 3 other remains found where Kris and Lisanne were found, which to me would indicate a dumping ground of some sort. To me, that's what it would indicate. There's really not that much found of Kris and Lisanne. And to my knowledge, none of the bones had scratch marks on them. No animal marks, no marks that, they're going down a river and they're hitting rock after rock after rock. There's not many bones really at all. But, just not covering the remains in detail and saying how there's different levels of decomposition, I think it's a haphazard job. How can you be conclusive? How can you say that, well, no foul play occurred and not cover that? How can you try to tell other people, try to get them to think that this was an accident, but not cover the remains? And then in your second video, you make a comment, like your basic line of reasoning is that if Kris and Lisanne, if they both were killed by people that abducted them, that people wouldn't abduct them and keep them as prisoner and then, plant evidence, their bones, and plant the phones and the backpack and stuff like that. Criminals would keep the money. Criminals would sell the phones and take the money or keep the phones, right? I mean, that's what you said. Pat, how can you say that in light of the Delphi murder case? I mean, you do know the Delphi murder case, right? 2 girls were killed. They took a picture of the person, of the potential killer. They actually recorded the killer's voice. And guess what? He left that at the scene of the crime. He killed 2 girls, and he left possessions there. How many people kill people? And they leave watches, they leave jewelries, they leave phones. So just because someone did not take money, just because someone didn't take possessions, doesn't mean they didn't kill someone. Pat, what would have happened, do you think, if they found several bones but no possessions of Lisanne and Kris? Do you think people would have ruled it? Do you think the authorities would have ruled it an accident? Don't you think having those extra belongings there kind of left the explanation point that this was most likely an accident theory? See, one issue I have, Pat, one issue I think that you make is you're trying to bring logic to murderers. Murderers aren't logical. Many murderers aren't, okay? Some murderers are really psychotic. They have issues. And when we try to apply reason and logic to how they would think, well, we can't in many cases. So just a blanket statement, well, if Kris and Lisanne would have been held captive, they were abducted for days, and then later killed, well, then the person wouldn't have left these belongings. Well, how can you say that when killers leave belongings all the time? People leave watches, jewelries, phones, credit cards all the time. The Delphi murder case, where a voice was recorded, a picture was recorded of the suspected killer, and he left it there on the scene. How can you make a blanket statement like that, Pat? You see how easy it is to make a rebuttal to your second video? Pat, you mentioned something like those, the women. I don't know if you call them girls or women. I'm going to call them women because I think women's more respectful. They were in their 20s. They were women. They weren't girls. You made a comment, I think, about how often they use those phones. Well, Pat, actually, I think the opposite. I think that it is crazy how they did not use they did not make that many phone calls at all those first 3 days. Those first 3 days, if you are lost, those first 3 days, do you not think that you would call more than twice the first day, more than 2 or 3 times the second, more than 2 or 3 times the third? I mean, you're lost in a clouded forest, and you make a total of, 6 or 7 calls over 3 days? That's not a lot of phone usage. Yeah, the phone might have been turned on to see, where the battery was. But, there's been some cases where I've sent a text message. There's been some cases where I actually got a signal where my phone said I shouldn't have got a signal. Back in 2014, well, I don't know if it was 2014, but yeah, there's been times where I looked at my phone and it showed no signal, and I made the phone call anyway. It happened. Now, was that a glitch in my phone? I don't know. But I'm saying that if you're desperate, you're going to be calling and calling and calling. You're not going to have 7 phone calls in 3 days. And Pat, you mentioned how important it is to have a guide. I think you had a quote like a guide knows even where certain leaves are on a trail. So get this. You say that this case shows you how important it is to have a guide, how important it was for Kris and Lisanne to have a guide on this trail and not go by themselves, because how well the guides knew the trail. But then when these guides were some of the people that were actually looking for Lisanne and Kris, and they knew the trail as much as you implied that a guide would know the trail, why wouldn't they find them? See, for the accident theory to be true, and this is important for us to realize, for the accident theory to be true, that first phone call is when something happened. That first emergency phone call. And if you just go by the eyewitnesses, if you just go by where they probably were on the trail, they did not make it very far. If they would have fallen and been immobile, dogs would have found them. Guides probably would have found them. They didn't make it very far. It's not like they were wandering, full, you can say, yeah, they were wandering around for 8 days. Well, for the accident theory to be true, something had to be happen for that first emergency call. If there was a fall, that's when it would have been. And they wouldn't have made it that far. And they would have fallen into a ravine. Don't you think that's one of the first places guides would have looked? Think about it. I mean, 2 women are lost. You're looking for them. They're missing. Aren't the ravines the first places you would look? Aren't the potential places where someone would fall the first places you would look on the trail? I think you would have done good going over the imperfect plan more on this. And in your video, I don't want to slander you, okay? I don't want to accuse you of something that you did. I don't recall you, Pat, mentioning the Imperfect Plan blog site. Them and Scarlett, I think, are the 2 most crucial, people that, sets of people that cover this case. I think the Imperfect Plan people, they actually went the Pianista Trail. They backpacked on it. They stayed there, and they got a lot of data that they reported back. And your conclusions on this case, Pat, it doesn't seem like you went to the Imperfect Plan website at all. Pat, you missed out on the eyewitnesses. Pat, you missed out on the remains. I mean, I'm not saying you... I think you mistranslated the remains. You didn't bring up the eyewitnesses. The attorney that the family hired, if this was an accident, Pat, why would the attorney that the family hired, why would he be persistent in saying that this was foul play? And get this. Okay, maybe he's biased. Maybe the attorney the family hired, he wants to keep his job. He wants to keep money coming in. So, of course, he's going to say it's foul play, right? Okay, you might argue that. What if it truly was an accident? Why on earth would someone threaten the attorney for the family's life? He's trying to get to the truth. He's trying to reopen the investigation. If it was just an accident, why would his life be threatened? Yet he claims his life was threatened. Why don't you cover that, Pat? I mean, just in this brief 15 minutes, these are some blockbuster things. Eyewitnesses, remains, the attorney, that you left out. How can you leave these things out? And it makes no sense for a killer to leave money or cell phones? Pat, obviously, we people that are sick, that commit heinous acts, we always can't get in their minds. But imagine this. Imagine you killed 2 women, and it hasn't been ruled either way, and people are still looking for those 2 women. How are you going to get people to stop looking for those 2 women? Well, you have to prove they're dead, and you have to make their death look like an accident, correct? I mean, obviously, if it looks like a murder, people are going to keep coming. You know, they're going to look for. It's not going to be a missing person case anymore. It's going to be a murder investigation, and they don't want that. So you had to plant some of their belongings. If just the bones would have been found without the cell phone, without the money would have been missing out of the backpack, well, some people might say, well, something's up with that. You know, I don't think it's too hard to figure out. And as I said before, you know, criminals think in different ways, and we can't make blanket statements. If you're lost, don't you think you would try to make more than 2 phone calls? But what's ironic, Pat, is if you put the eyewitness accounts with the women starting the trail at about 3, and then if you have the accounts of the phone calls, and the first phone call for danger was about 4:30, maybe a little bit after that, maybe 4:45, sometime in that range, you don't have a lot of time before something went wrong. Do you see how your theory kind of, it just doesn't jive with the evidence we have? And then how could you say there's no evidence of foul play? I mean, just the things I've already mentioned. Isn't it obvious that foul play most likely happened? Now, you're a criminal profiler. I am not a trained criminal profiler. I am a trained historian, though, and I do know his history is made up by trying to come up with what's most probable. Most things we don't know for sure what happened. We judge the probability based on evidence and based on data. And if we judge the probability based on this, according to history, because this happened in 2014, it is history, there's a higher probability of foul play by far, and you're not doing any favors to anyone by saying that it's an accident. Something else I wanted to mention. Something else. And this is, Pat, something else that you didn't mention that I want to mention. The photos. Don't you find some of the odd things about the photos? Why didn't you mention some of these odd things? And I'm not talking about the night photos. They're all odd, the night photos. Photo 499 and 500. Photo 499 has a picture of Kris on the summit. And not Kris, I'm sorry. It has a picture of Lisanne. Lisanne's on one side. She's on the viewer of the photo's right. And there's the scenery on the left. Now, it looks like a nice, beautiful day. Now, 7 seconds later is photo 500. Lisanne is on the other side of the picture. She's on the left. and the day looks like it's a gloomy, dark day. Now, clouds and landscapes change. Normally not in 7 seconds, though. In 7 seconds, for the posture of Lisanne to change, for the direction of the picture to change. Either Lisanne moved herself or Lisanne and Kris both were moving, but for both to move and for there to be a radical change in the landscape, it would have taken more than 7 seconds to take those two pictures. If you go through all the pictures that have been released of Lisanne and Kris, do you see any blurry shots? I mean, I guess you might say one's blurry where Kris is kind of leaning down to the ground on the trail. But, besides that, and that's blurry because it's dark, not because it was taking, I don't think it was taking badly. It was just dark. But do you see any blurry shots? Like when I'm taking a picture of my dog is so hard to get a picture of because he won't stay still for 1-2 seconds. And it takes at least 1 second for my phone to take a picture. And by the time my phone takes the picture, my dog's moving. He's blurred. You can tell that he moved while the picture was taken. Do you see any of the blurry pictures in any of those photographs? Of course not. You don't. Which means, I think that indicates how deliberate Kris and Lisanne were at taking pictures. They just weren't snapping off real quick or there'd be more blurry pictures. And for that picture, $4.99 to $500, for that to make sense in 7 seconds. Have you considered that? Have you, Pat, considered the case of the picture of Kris, the back of Kris's head? The night photo. You know what I'm talking about. I hope you know what I'm talking about. The back of Kris's head, that night photo. What do you fail to see in that picture? Green shrubbery, dirt. Her hair looks awfully clean, doesn't it? Even if you took a bath in a lake, you would get some sort of debris in your hair. There's nothing in her hair, and her hair's lighted up. Can you explain that? You don't think that points to some sort of strange foul play? I do. I think if someone's lost in a jungle for 8 days, their hair should be full of wild dirt and debris. You don't see that in that picture. You see a scalp, but you see a clean scalp. I already went over the search parties, and they would have fallen in their ravine, and it had to be very soon because that's when that first emergency call found. The search parties would have found them, but they ended up being way off course. The lack of phone calls is very, Pat. I think most people, if they're lost in a forest, they're gonna be calling their phone, and calling their phone. Even if there's no bars, they're gonna be trying to call their phone because once in a while it might go through. Like I said before, sometimes I've called and I've connected a call sometimes when I started the call it showed no signals. Now maybe a signal did happen. Maybe I was walking and I looked at the phone and there's no signals, but then by the time I put it in my head, well, there was service. Maybe that was the case. But my point is that people would be desperate, I think, in trying to get a phone call. Pat, I wonder, logically speaking, we're dealing with statistics here. Why would you jump to the conclusion that it was an accident? An accidental death? Why they were lost and they starved to death? Why would you jump to that conclusion? How many more people die in Panama? Do they die from murder? Or do they die from being lost in the forest? Do more people die from being... I did an animal in the statistics of this. People technically usually are murdered. Are far more likely to be murdered than die from a spider bite. People are more likely to be murdered than to fall into a ravine. So just the stats are against them being lost. To your own experience into this case. I think that you failed to let all the aspects of this case speak for itself. I think you brought too much of your own experience at certain locations. And let me tell you something. Just because you've been to one location doesn't mean that you can fully speak about another one, even if it is close by. You know, I've been to St. Thomas. I've been to Jamaica. And let me tell you, those two places are relatively close by. They are different. Italy's not that far away from Paris. They are different. People are different. Crime levels are different. In the same city, places can be much different. In the same city, if you have a 20-minute drive, if you have a 15-minute drive, sometimes if you're in the city of Chicago, just a 10-minute walk from one location to another could raise the chances of a crime hugely. So just saying, well, I've been here, and here, and here, and people misinterpret, how the crime in these places. Pat, places are different. Just because you've been to one place, you can't speak for another place. I think you're reading too much of your own experience into this specific case, and you haven't let this case speak for itself. I don't believe that this case is about sex trafficking. I believe it's about people that abducted Kris and Lisanne, killed them, and that was that. But you brought up a point about sex trafficking, Pat. I think you did. Now, I could be wrong. I don't want to defame you or anything like that, okay? I don't want to put words in your mouth. But I think you said this. I think you said that this wasn't sex trafficking because people that were in sex trafficking, they wouldn't take the risk of getting European tourists if they could have just got local poor women, because the local poor women would be much easier to get, and they were more accessible, and they would be easier to grab. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you made that point. And if I think about that point, I just think that's incredibly naive, if that is such a point you made. Pat, if you do think that the poor women would be much more likely for the sex traffickers to get, yeah, I agree. They would be easier to get. But think about this for a second. If you're in Central America, now I don't think this was about sex trafficking, but if it was, if you're in Central America, if you're in South America, you see how Kris and Lisanne looked. They were very attractive women. And their skin tone wasn't exactly the norm for Central or South America. Yes, there are white people in those places, but that's not normally the norm. Don't you think two women that were foreigners like Kris and Lisanne, don't you think that they would get premium in sex trafficking that I've exhibited? That you did a haphazard job in your video, on both your videos. And if you still aren't convinced, I'm not trying to bully you. I'm not trying to badger you in any way. I think you did a poor job. And I think that I think I debunked your a lot of your viewpoints on a lot of your conclusions you made. If you disagree, I'll gladly debate you.